Okay, so, you sent over a really interesting collection of articles this time.
Yeah.
And they all seem to be about like how we build the web and the
Hmm.
languages that
Yeah.
we use, and then also the security vulnerabilities that are,
Like, yeah,
part of all that.
totally. It's a
So
big topic.
it is a big topic.
Yeah.
So what we want to do today is we want to like really dig deep into all this stuff and kind of pick out like the most important things and help people understand what it all means. Whether
Exactly.
you're thinking about like coding your first website, or you're just curious about how this all works, or
Hmm.
even if you're just, dealing with technology in your everyday life and you want to be more informed
Right.
about how it all works.
I think that's key these days.
Yeah.
Just to be aware of what's going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've got everything from discussions about like the most popular programming languages
Uh-huh.
that are going to be used in the next year or so,
Yep.
to talking about, serious vulnerabilities and how different languages stack up against each other in terms of security.
Absolutely. And how those vulnerabilities are found
Oh,
too.
yeah, yeah. And we've got,
That's a whole other area.
yeah, and we've got those like front end frameworks that you see everywhere.
Oh yeah, the frameworks.
So what we're going to do is we're going to start with like just the basics, like what are we even talking about when we talk about building the web?
Right.
And then we'll talk about, the different languages themselves.
Yeah.
And then finally, the really important stuff, which is how do we keep it all safe?
That's the critical part.
Yeah.
It is.
Okay, let's unpack this.
All right. So, I mean, when you think about the web, it's really like a performance,
Yeah.
like you have all these different actors and they're all playing different roles.
Right.
Um, and, you have the front end, which is everything that you see and interact with in your browser.
Yeah.
Like the layout, the buttons, the
Yeah.
images.
Hmm.
Um, it's really all about how you interact with a website and what it looks like.
Right. So that's the part that we all see,
Exactly.
when we go to a website.
Exactly.
That's the front end.
That's the front end, yeah.
And then you have the back end, which is,
Kind of like behind the curtain.
yeah, it's all the stuff that we don't see, but it's doing all the work.
Right. All the heavy lifting.
Right.
You've got the logic that makes everything work.
Yeah.
The databases that store all the information.
Mm-hmm.
And the servers that make it all possible.
So this is like where all the brains of the operation are.
Exactly. The brains and the brawn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then, of course, you have like the full stack developers
Right.
that can kind of do it all.
Yeah, they're like the multi-talented.
They are. They're like the Swiss Army knives of the web development world.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
They can work on the front end or the back end.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the front end first. And we'll start with those core languages that you mentioned,
Right.
HTML, CSS, and JavaScript.
Yes. The holy trinity
Yeah.
of front-end development.
So I think I saw this analogy in one of the articles and I really liked it. So it's like you're
Yeah.
building a house. HTML is like the blueprint. It's
Yeah.
the structural framework, it defines where the walls go, where the doors are.
Makes sense.
And then CSS, that's like the interior designer.
Right.
That's what's adding all the style and the paint colors and making sure the furniture is arranged, right?
Yeah. And it makes sure that the house looks good on different size lots,
Oh, yeah.
whether it's a tiny house or a mansion.
That's a good point. Yeah, because CSS is what makes a website look good on different screen sizes.
Exactly.
Right, so whether you're on your phone or you're on the desktop computer.
Right. Responsiveness. That's the
Yeah.
key.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then JavaScript.
Now, JavaScript is like the electricity and the plumbing.
Okay.
It's what brings the house to life, makes it functional, makes things happen.
So that's like, when you click a button on a website and something happens.
Exactly.
Or you see those like cool animations or things update without the whole page having to reload.
Yes, all that dynamic interactive stuff.
Yeah.
That's JavaScript at work.
Okay, so those are the fundamental building blocks.
Right.
But then it gets a little bit more complicated.
It does.
Because you've got these frameworks
Right.
that come into play.
The frameworks.
And the ones that we saw mentioned most were Angular, React, and Vue.
Yeah, those are the big three right now.
So what are these frameworks all about?
Well, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, they're great for building small websites.
Mm-hmm.
But when you start building really big, complex applications, things can get messy
Okay.
really fast.
So it's like if you were building a skyscraper instead of just a house.
Exactly. You need a more robust set of blueprints and tools,
Right.
and that's where frameworks come in. They provide a more organized and efficient way to build and maintain large front-end applications.
So they're like prefabricated kits?
Yeah. You could think of it that way.
Okay.
They come with ready-made components and structures, so you don't have to start from scratch every time.
Right, like pre-built walls or something.
Yeah, or like a
Yeah.
plumbing system that's already partially assembled.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah,
So that speeds up development.
exactly. And it helps keep the code more organized and easier to manage.
All right, so tell me about these three frameworks.
Here.
What are they all about?
Well, each one has its own kind of personality and its own strengths and weaknesses.
Okay.
It really depends on the specific project and the team's preferences.
All right.
So React, for example, is really popular right now.
It seems like it's everywhere.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's very flexible. It performs really well.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a huge community of developers who use it.
So if you run into a problem, chances are someone else has already solved it. And you can find the answer online.
You got it.
Okay.
The downside is that it can be a little bit more complex to set up initially.
Okay.
There's a little bit more of a learning curve.
So it's not necessarily the easiest one to just jump into?
Right. It takes a little bit more effort up front,
Okay.
but once you learn it, it's really powerful.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about Vue?
Now, Vue is known for being really approachable and easy to learn.
Okay.
It's a great choice for beginners or for adding interactive elements to existing websites.
So, like, if you just want to sprinkle in a little bit of interactivity,
Yeah, exactly.
you don't need to go all in on a big framework.
Correct.
You could use Vue.
Vue is a good option for that.
Okay.
It's also really well suited for smaller projects,
Mm-hmm.
but it might not be the best choice for really massive enterprise-level applications.
Okay. So it has its limitations.
Yeah, there are some trade-offs.
Okay. What about Angular?
So Angular is a bit different.
Okay.
It's more of a comprehensive framework, almost like an all-in-one solution.
So it gives you everything you need.
Yeah, it provides a lot of structure and guidance,
Oh,
which can be really helpful for large, complex projects.
right. Because if you have a big team of developers all working on the same project,
Exactly.
you need some kind of structure to keep everyone on the same page.
You need some rules, some guidelines.
Right. So Angular provides that.
It does,
Okay.
but it does have a steeper learning curve.
Oh, okay.
So it's not necessarily the easiest one for beginners to pick up.
And this is the one that's developed by Google, right?
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
Google is the main backer behind Angular.
So is there a clear winner here? Like, which of these frameworks is the best?
Well, there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Okay.
It really depends on the specific needs of the project.
Right.
But we did see some interesting data in one of the articles.
Okay.
They did a survey of developers,
Uh-huh.
and it showed that React was the most widely used,
Okay.
and it also had the highest satisfaction rate,
Interesting.
meaning that developers who use React are very likely to use it again.
So that kind of suggests that it's a good choice?
It does seem to be the industry favorite right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about Vue and Angular?
So Vue also had a high satisfaction rate.
Okay.
A lot of developers said they would use it again.
So it sounds like it's a good option too.
It does, especially for those smaller projects.
Right.
Angular, on the other hand,
Mm-hmm.
while it's still widely used, it didn't have quite the same level of enthusiasm.
Well, maybe it's not as trendy.
Maybe not, but it's still a solid choice for large-scale applications.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it seems like React and Vue are the ones to watch.
Definitely. They're both gaining momentum.
All right.
Yeah.
So that's the front end.
That's the front end.
Now let's dive into the back end.
All right, let's go behind the scenes.
Yeah. So this is where things get even more diverse.
Much more diverse.
Right.
We're talking about a whole bunch of different languages.
Yeah, like Python, Ruby, PHP, Java,
Node.js.
Node.js.
And even the old guard, C and C++.
Yeah, they're still around.
They're still kicking.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what do all these languages do on the back end?
Well, they do a lot of different things.
Okay.
But one of the main things is they handle communication with databases.
Now, when you say databases, what are we talking about exactly?
So a database is basically like a giant organized collection of information.
Okay.
It's like a digital filing cabinet.
So like all the information about users on a website.
Exactly. Or all the products in an online store.
Okay.
Or all the posts on a social media platform.
So all that data is stored in a database.
Right. And the back-end languages are what allow us to access and manipulate that data.
So when you log into a website and you see your profile information, that's a back-end language fetching that data from the database.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, are all databases the same?
Not at all.
Okay.
There are actually two main types of databases.
Okay.
SQL databases and NoSQL databases.
So what's the difference?
So SQL databases are the traditional kind. They're very structured and organized.
Okay.
They use tables with rows and columns to store data.
So it's like a spreadsheet.
Yeah, kind of like spreadsheet.
Okay.
Some popular examples of SQL databases are MySQL and PostgreSQL.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about NoSQL databases?
So NetSQL databases are more flexible.
Okay.
They don't necessarily use tables.
So they're not as structured.
Right, they're more like a collection of documents.
Okay.
So they're good for storing data that's not easily organized into rows and columns.
So like what kind of data are we talking about?
Well, for example, social media posts.
Uh-huh.
They often have different types of content like text, images, videos.
Right.
That wouldn't fit neatly into a traditional SQL database.
Okay.
Some popular examples of NoSQL databases are MongoDB and Cassandra.
Okay, so it seems like you choose the type of database based on the kind of data you're storing.
Exactly. You choose the right tool for the job.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, you also mentioned servers. So what do servers do on the back end?
Well, servers are basically like the computers that host websites.
Yeah.
They're powerful machines that are designed to run 24/7.
So they're always available.
Right. They're always there waiting to serve up web pages to users.
And what kind of technologies do these servers use?
Well, there are a lot of different options.
Okay.
Some popular web server software includes Apache and Nginx.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also have the big cloud platforms.
Like AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure.
Exactly.
So those are like giant networks of servers that you can rent.
Yeah, they provide all the infrastructure you need to host your website.
And you don't have to worry about maintaining your own physical servers.
Right, you just pay for what you use.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So how does all of this back-end stuff connect to the big picture?
Well, choosing the right back-end technologies is crucial for building a successful website.
Okay.
You have to consider things like performance, scalability, security, and cost.
So you have to think about how fast your website needs to be, how many users it needs to handle, how secure it needs to be, and how much you're willing to spend.
Exactly, it's a lot to juggle.
Right.
And the choice of language often comes down to very practical considerations.
Like what?
Like what languages your development team is already familiar with,
Mm-hmm.
or what kind of infrastructure your company already has in place.
Right. So you're not just choosing a language based on its technical merits.
Not always.
You're also thinking about the practical realities of your situation.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, earlier you mentioned full stack developers,
Right.
and you said they're kind of like the Swiss Army knives of web development
They are?
because they can work on both the front end and the back end.
That's right.
So for someone who's interested in getting into web development,
Huh?
where do they even start with all these different languages?
Well, if you want to work on the front end,
Mm-hmm.
then HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are absolutely essential.
Those are the non-negotiables.
Those are the must-haves.
Okay.
They're the foundation of everything you see and interact with on the web.
And luckily, there are a lot of resources available online for learning those languages.
Absolutely. Tons of free and paid resources.
So it's a good place to start.
Yeah, it's a great place to start.
And then what about the back end?
So for the back end, it really depends on what you're interested in
Okay.
and what kind of career path you're looking for.
So if someone's interested in data science or machine learning,
Then Python is a great option.
Python.
Yeah, it's a very versatile language.
Uh-huh.
It's used for web development, but it's also used in a lot of other fields.
And it's known for being relatively easy to learn.
Yeah, it has a really clean syntax.
Okay.
It's very beginner-friendly.
And there's a big community around it.
Huge community, very supportive.
So you can always find help if you need it.
Exactly.
Okay.
And, a lot of the popular Python web frameworks like Django and Flask,
Uh-huh.
they come with built-in security features.
So that's a big plus.
It is, because it means you don't have to worry about
Yeah.
implementing all the security measures yourself from scratch.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, what about Java?
Now, Java is a different beast.
Okay.
It's a very powerful language.
Uh-huh.
It's been around for a long time.
It's kind of the old reliable.
It is.
Yeah.
It's known for its write once, run anywhere capability.
What does that mean?
So it means that you can write Java code once,
Uh-huh.
and it can run on any operating system without having to make major changes.
So it's very portable.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's also really good at handling large, complex applications.
So it's used a lot in enterprise settings.
Yeah, big companies love Java,
Okay.
and it has really strong memory management.
So it's not prone to crashing.
Less prone to crashing, yeah.
Okay.
And it has a huge, mature ecosystem.
What does that mean?
So it means there are tons of libraries and frameworks and tools available,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a large, active community of developers.
So you can always find support.
Exactly. So if you're looking for a language that's powerful, it's reliable, and has a lot of support,
Yeah.
Java's a great choice.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then there's C#.
C# is another popular choice. It's often associated with Microsoft's ASP.NET framework.
Which is used for building back-end applications.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's an object-oriented language,
Mm-hmm.
which means it's good at organizing code into reusable modules.
Okay.
It's also type-safe,
Which
which
means...
means it helps catch certain types of errors early on in the development process,
Okay.
so it can lead to more robust code.
Okay, so that's good for preventing bugs.
It is, yeah.
And C# has a lot of support from Microsoft.
It does.
So there are a lot of good tools and resources available.
It's right.
Like Visual Studio.
Yes, Visual Studio is a very popular integrated development environment for C#.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you're working in a Microsoft environment,
Uh-huh.
C# is a good option.
It's a natural choice.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now what about Go?
So Go, also known as Golang,
Golang.
is a bit newer than some of these other languages,
Mm-hmm.
but it's gaining popularity really quickly.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's special about Go?
Well, it's known for being really efficient,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it comes to handling concurrency,
Concurrency.
which means doing multiple things at the same time.
Okay.
So it's really good for building applications that need to be fast and responsive.
Like what kind of applications?
Well, things like web servers,
Right.
cloud applications.
Those are things that have to handle a lot of traffic at the same time.
Exactly. They need to be able to juggle multiple requests simultaneously.
Okay.
Go is also known for being very fast
Uh,
because it compiles directly to machine code.
so it doesn't have to be interpreted at runtime.
Right. It's already in the language that the computer understands.
Okay.
It has a really simple syntax,
So it's easy to learn.
relatively easy to learn,
Okay.
and it comes with a strong standard library,
Which means?
which means it has a lot of built-in functionality.
So you don't have to write everything yourself from scratch.
Exactly.
Right.
So even though it's a relatively young language,
Uh-huh.
it's already very powerful and capable.
And is there good support for it?
The community is growing rapidly,
Okay.
and there are more and more resources available all the time.
Okay, so it sounds like Go is one to watch.
Definitely, it has a lot of potential.
All right.
Yeah.
What about Ruby?
So Ruby is another language that's known for being really programmer-friendly.
Mm-hmm.
It has a really elegant syntax,
Okay.
and it's often praised for being fun to work with.
Fun to work with.
Yeah. A lot of developers really enjoy using Ruby.
Okay.
It's often associated with the Ruby on Rails framework,
Uh-huh.
which is known for rapid development.
Okay, so you can build web applications quickly using Ruby on Rails,
Exactly.
but there's but.
There's a but.
Right.
Ruby has had some security vulnerabilities in recent years.
So it's not as secure as some of the other languages?
Well, that's a complex issue.
Okay.
It's not necessarily that the language itself is insecure.
Mm-hmm.
It's more that there have been some vulnerabilities discovered in some of the libraries and frameworks that are commonly used with Ruby.
So it's kind of like a chain is only as strong as its weakest link.
Exactly.
Even if the language itself is secure, if there are vulnerabilities in the libraries that you're using,
Uh-huh.
that can still create security risks.
Absolutely.
So what kind of vulnerabilities have been found in Ruby?
Well, some of them have been related to denial of service attacks,
Denial of service.
which means that an attacker can overload a system
Uh-huh.
and prevent legitimate users from accessing it.
So they can basically shut down a website.
Yeah. Or at least make it really slow and unusable.
Okay.
And some of these vulnerabilities have been found in libraries like RxML and URI,
Uh-huh.
which are pretty widely used in the Ruby ecosystem.
So they're not just obscure libraries.
Right. They're pretty common.
Okay.
Yeah.
And were there any other vulnerabilities?
Yeah. There have been vulnerabilities reported in other areas too.
Like what?
What, like in how Ruby handles email
Yeah.
with the NetAmap library,
Uh-huh.
or how it generates documentation with RDoc,
Okay.
and even in core components
Yeah.
like OpenSSL,
OpenSSL.
which is used for encryption.
So that's pretty serious.
It is, because if there's a vulnerability in OpenSSL,
Mm-hmm.
that could potentially affect a lot of different applications.
Right, because encryption is used everywhere.
Exactly.
So it's not just a Ruby problem.
Right, it's a broader security concern.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then there was one specific vulnerability that I thought was really interesting.
Okay.
It was in the Ruby SAML gem.
Oh, yeah, that one.
So tell me about that.
So SAML stands for Security Assertion Markup Language.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a standard that's often used for implementing single sign-on,
Single sign-on.
which means that you can log in once,
Uh-huh.
and then you have access to multiple different applications.
So like if you have a Google account.
Exactly. You can use it to log in to all sorts of different websites. So the Ruby SAML gem is a library that's used to implement SAML in Ruby applications.
And the vulnerability that was found, what was that all about?
Well, it's called an XML external entity injection.
XML external entity injection.
Yeah, it's a mouthful.
Yeah.
But basically it means that an attacker could potentially access sensitive files on the server.
Like what kind of files?
Well, things like configuration files,
Um,
database credentials.
that's really bad.
Yeah, it could be really bad.
So this vulnerability could have allowed attackers to steal sensitive information?
It could have,
Okay.
or it could have allowed them to cause a denial of service.
So again, shutting down the website.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah,
so this is a good example of how security is not just about the language itself.
right.
It's also about the libraries and frameworks that you're using.
Absolutely.
And it's about keeping those libraries up to date.
Yes, because new vulnerabilities are being discovered all the time.
So you have to stay on top of it.
You do. It's a constant battle.
Okay, so we've talked about Python, Java, C#, Go, Ruby.
Uh-huh.
Is there anything else?
Oh, yeah, we haven't talked about PHP yet, which is
Uh,
another very popular language.
Yeah.
It's been around for a long time,
Uh-huh.
and it's used by a lot of websites.
So what's PHP all about?
Well, it's a server-side scripting language,
Okay.
which means that it runs on the server
Uh-huh.
and it generates dynamic content,
Dynamic content.
which means content that changes based on user interaction.
So like if you fill out a form on a website,
Uh-huh.
PHP might be used to process that form data
Exactly.
and then generate a response.
Right.
So it's kind of like the glue that holds a lot of websites together.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
And what about security?
So PHP has had its share of security issues over the years,
Okay.
but it's also been improved a lot.
So it's gotten better?
It has.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about C and C++?
So C and C++ are really interesting languages.
Okay.
They're very powerful, and they're used for all sorts of things.
Like what?
Well, they're used for operating systems,
Yeah.
device drivers,
Video games.
video games,
Okay.
high-performance computing.
So they're kind of like the workhorses of the programming world,
They are.
but they're not used as much for web development these days.
Right. They're more commonly used for systems programming,
Okay.
but they are still used in some areas of web development.
Like what?
Well, for example, if you need to build a really performance-critical component,
Uh-huh.
or if you need to interact directly with hardware,
Okay.
then C or C++ might be a good choice.
But they're not the first choice for most web developers?
Not usually.
Why not?
Well, they're more complex to work with,
Okay.
and they're more prone to certain types of errors.
Like security vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
So what are the security concerns with C and C++?
Well, one of the main concerns is memory safety,
Memory safety.
which is basically the ability of a language to prevent certain types of programming error. That can lead to security vulnerabilities.
Okay.
So, for example, in C and C++,
Mm-hmm.
it's possible for a programmer to accidentally access memory that they're not supposed to.
Okay. How does that happen?
Well, it can happen in a few different ways.
Uh-huh.
One common way is through something called a buffer overflow.
Host.